Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast. We're back with another fantastic episode from Latitude 59 here in Estonia. And today we're speaking with the influential Sten Tamkivi, an entrepreneur since the age of 18. Sten has a long history of pushing boundaries in the tech sector, from founding the first digital media agency in Estonia to his key role at Skype, where he helped propel the company to an incredible $8.5 billion exit to Microsoft. Now, currently, Sten is making waves with the Plural Platform, investing in cutting-edge tech companies in their earliest stages. So today we're going to be delving into topics such as the culture of founders backing founders, the importance of Europe's role in the global tech scene, and lessons learned from the evolution of the Estonian tech scene. But enough from me. Buckle up and hold on tight, because it's time for me to beam your ears all the way to Estonia, where Sten, he's waiting to share his unique insights. So, a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thank you so much. Great to be here, and welcome to Tallinn. My name is Sten Tamkivi, and I'm a partner at Plural Platform, which is a relatively new venture platform that we created to help founders back more founders. Like, we're taking experienced operators and founders of very large companies who have been CEOs and executives at scale, and giving them a mechanism how they can go and lead Series C, Series A rounds in up-and-coming sort of future legendary companies around Europe.
It's fair to say this is not your first rodeo. You've been at the helm of numerous successful ventures, including Teleport and Skype. But I've got to ask, can you share your origin story, maybe the moment that lit the spark for your passion for technology, and how it would ultimately put you on the path that you're on today?
So I was born and raised here in Estonia, in a small town called Tartu, which is kind of the Cambridge of Estonia, like the university town. I started my first company straight out of high school. So kind of entered the university, started my first company, dropped out soon after because I had to choose between those two, and have been in software and entrepreneurship ever since. But if you think of the Estonian history, like when I was growing up as in middle school, still under Soviet occupation, being an entrepreneur was a criminal offense. And by finishing high school, I've been doing nothing but that ever since. So it's like a very sort of a full-on alignment of stars, and being born in a free and open society where you can go and build things, and there are very little hierarchies, and small teams can make magic happen at large scale. And that's what I've been doing all my life.
Small teams can make magic happen. I love that line. And you also more recently co-founded the Plural Platform with a philosophy of founders supporting founders. So can you dive a little bit deeper into that concept and also explain how it's been instrumental in the success of this platform too?
Yeah, so the way startup investing works, it's like this continuum that in the beginning you have two girls and an idea.
Yeah.
And then you have all these sort of things that happen and funding rounds that happen and the company grows all the way until the IPO or eventual exit. And if you look at the skills that the investors need to be effective and supportive at different stages of that company, like when you get close to this IPO phase, then it's like people with spreadsheets who look at discounted cash flow models and analyze the customer data and all of that. But in that very early first days of the company, none of that exists. It's basically there is no company. There's all risks, and you need to start unpacking and figuring that out. And what we believe at Plural is that in order for anybody to help you in that phase, like the only way you can really provide that help is that if you've been in those shoes yourself.
Yeah.
And that's where you see a lot of former founders and entrepreneurs becoming angel investors and sort of supporting the next generation of founders. And at Plural, we are scaling that movement up. And it was fascinating when we started sort of talking to founders and seeing what kind of investors they appreciate the most, and figuring out why that phenomenon doesn't exist at that scale. In US, in the top VC firms in that country and very mature ecosystem, more than 60% of the partners at VC firms have built a company before. And in Europe and in UK, that percent is 10. So it's like 90% of people investing in early stage tech have never built a company. They are fantastic people from finance and consulting and all other fields of life, But we feel that we can do better. And it's not that every investor needs to be a former founder, but we are trying to find the best and the strongest experienced operators at scale and bring them together. We raised a 260 million euro fund to help these sort of former operators to go and lead maybe 2 companies a year, get really involved, hands-on, set the price, set the terms, agree with the founder what kind of help do they need besides money, and get going.
And something I wanted to highlight today is Estonia is a real hub of innovation, and there's so many tech unicorns here as well, from Bolt to Wise to Veriff, all originating here in Estonia. So how do you see Estonian leadership influencing global tech trends, particularly in terms of embedding things like societal values into technologies?
In many ways, I believe Estonia could be viewed in geeky tech circles. There's this term called the MVP, minimum viable product. So Estonia could be the minimum viable country to show how we can do this in the rest of Europe. So basically 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we had the first startup. Skype was founded in 2003. So after that, that's the point zero where we start counting time. And now we have 1,400 teams building 1.2 billion euros a year going into early stage capital. So it's basically per capita, it's like Silicon Valley, Israel, Estonia is where unicorns get born. And there's nothing special in the water here. It's just like people who with ambition and global outlook and sort of the willingness to go through the sort of the hard early phases and build something great and have an impact. And that's something that I think we can do way more in Europe. And you mentioned values. I think Europe has a very specific set of what I would call like humanist values. That when we build technologies here, there is maybe something different how we think about different languages and diversity and culture and the design elements of technology and privacy and some other topics which are very values driven. And I think some of the things, if we can take those European values and capture them in technology well and export them globally, that will create a better world for the humankind, I believe. So
wow,
that's something that, like, maybe we tried it on a small model, let's do it on a big one now.
Love that. Absolutely beautiful. And speaking of those societal values, you've been a vocal advocate for a more tolerant, open and creative society. So how have these values informed your own entrepreneurial journey and your investment strategy too?
Like, if you look at the successful startup, typically, like, you cannot win if you do something 10% bigger. You have to do something 10 times bigger. You have to open up a new market. You can create something that the people couldn't imagine that they could use. Like, you really, like, that's the changing the world. If you start unpacking what that could practically mean, then you get to sort of this very sort of pattern and habit breaking things. By definition, when anything like that emerges, it will look different from status quo.
Yeah.
And that's what sort of openness and diversity is about, is that to not sort of shame, kill, and ridicule the things that look different and are fragile and early and nascent, but sort of nurture them and let them grow. And some of them will grow up and some of them will die. That's the startup game. That's the sort of the entire set of metaphors from seeding a company and the startup like blossoming or like whatever. And that's all about a society that can tolerate different views, new viewpoints, creative ideas, and all of that. And that's very interesting. I think very often the tech industry is very, very sort of equated to real sciences. And there is like a very strong real sciences component. Like, without math and physics, we wouldn't be building any tech companies. But it should never be limited to that. I think true magic usually happens when you have an amazing engineer, an amazing designer, and somebody who understands the customers, like has the empathy, or like can define the business or a product in a way that people actually want to use that, and it changes. So like, if you have like 3 or 4 such people together, the magic happens at the intersection. And that's, again, like, that requires that you have a diverse society where those collaborations can happen.
And I was also reading that you're on a mission to have a GDP level impact on Europe with the Plural Platform. So can you elaborate on that ambition and how you plan to achieve it too?
It's actually pretty straightforward. So again, Estonia has the MVP. 15 years ago, no startups. Now it's about 1% of the working population in startups, 3% of GDP and more coming from startups. If you add other tech, by 2030, it will be 1/3 of the economy. So if you apply that model, but the Estonian economy is tiny. But if on European level, if you have European GDP is at 16 trillion euros a year. So if you start thinking back at that, 160 billion is a 1 percentage point impact. There are about 30 tech companies in the world that are worth more than 100 billion, and only 2 of them are from Europe. So basically, the formula is very simple. Right? Need a few more of those, and that's percentage points of impact. And if you look at majority of those companies are in the US, and the top 4 or 5 of them are trillion-dollar or multi-trillion-dollar companies. So 100 billion is not the ceiling of what the world is capable of, but rather an interesting, nice and achievable milestone on the way. And we've done it a few times from Europe, and we will do many times more. And when we create a 100 billion company, that will mean tens or hundreds of 10 and $1 billion companies, and many, many jobs created, many more creative ideas getting built into products, and sort of impact that is positive way outside of this one success story.
Incredibly cool. And of course, looking back throughout your career, you've been involved in the Estonian tech scene right since the early days, founding the first digital media agency in the country. So can you share some key lessons you've learned from the evolution of the tech ecosystem in Estonia? I suspect you've seen a few changes along the way.
My personal key lesson, never sell hours when you come from a place which doesn't have that many people. So that's what we started doing in my first companies, sort of in mid-90s, was we started as an agency and helping build other internet presence for other companies. But very quickly we moved on from there and building products. Like if you really want to build a scalable business, then you need to build something that makes money while you sleep, not when you work.
And you have also constantly supported the startup movement and actively advocated for better tech education. That's where it begins. So how do you envision a future for the tech landscape, and what role do you see education playing in that vision too?
There is, again, this sort of we can't go without real sciences and very strong foundation of understanding how the universe works and the math and logic behind that. And that's useful in any field. But then again, I think it's also if you look at the very rigid school systems of today around Europe and around the world, it's still you get graded if you get the right answer. In work life, you usually don't have the right answer. It's very rigid time schedules, very sort of physical, very much lecture based, that sort of things that you have very little resemblance to what people's actual entrepreneurial or work lives look later. So I think the education needs to adapt to those things. And I think it's interesting how, on a local level here, many Estonian founders, when they have success, when they have exits, when they start thinking about giving back to the society, they start immediately investing in education. So it seems to be a common theme that we need to fix that for having any other things built on top. But then on a more global basis, we're seeing a great wave of also commercial startups and tech companies that are tackling, chipping away from the corners of this, using AI in education, using video, doing things remotely, getting better teachers, more FaceTime with more students that they're not physically in the same room with, like stuff like that, which is great, because then you can sort of point the finger to any government and say that you have to do it, but then entrepreneurs just do it.
I love that. And obviously we're recording this episode at Latitude 59 here in Estonia. I'm curious, are there any key themes in the conversations and keynotes this year, and maybe a few ideas? What are you going to be thinking about on the way home when you think about and reflect everything that you've seen and heard here?
If I think of this conference and maybe conferences in like in Estonia, Finland, in this corner of Europe, over the last decade, everything has matured a lot. Many people have already built their first business, and maybe it was a B2B SaaS business with a very clear business model and so forth. When they go on the second or third round, then they are really craving for big missions. And so there is a lot of talk around how can we fix the climate crisis, and how can we solve some of the sort of major problems that the world is facing. And people are not scared of also looking for more complex and more expensive tooling for that. So it used to be more about purely software, and now it's more and more like how can we use science in material sciences, or like how do we store or transfer energy, and like these topics where there is a big, hard, hairy physical component to that, which is much harder for startups to tackle, and it takes a lot more bravery, and it's definitely there. And maybe the other thing is that there is way more openness about the dark side of this sort of tech game, like the burnouts and failures, and I think maybe these things. Failure in Europe in general 10 years ago was much more of a massive taboo than in the US, for example. And I think we've gotten way better in sort of discussing and dissecting, like how do you deal with failure? How do you deal with personal sort of burnouts and mental issues and sort of working through the hardship? So it's good to see those topics covered as well.
And throughout your career, you've had to continuously evolve and adapt with these trends. And I think now more than ever, there's a real pressure on everyone to be in a state of almost continuous learning. So I've got to ask, how do you self-educate and keep ahead of the curve? Is there any tips around that?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've noticed in the recent years is that I've kind of done the full circle and come back more towards long form.
Yeah.
So like it's super easy to sort of get carried away with the news of the day and watch the headlines and see the world swoosh by and feel that you're on top of things and you're informed.
Yeah.
But like for more complex problems, anything from the sort of science solving big problems with technology, or I don't know, geopolitics or war in Ukraine or like US versus China competition in Europe, so like that. Like you can read all the headlines you want, but eventually you want to read a good book or listen to one proper lecture and spend an hour or two on this topic. And so I've noticed my consumption habits. I do get my occasional podcast in, but I think like long form, 8 hours in an audiobook is back as well. So it's like something that for a few years I kind of like had moved away from it. Now in the last few years, I've figured that I need that in my life.
100% with you on that. And for anyone wanting to learn more about the Plural Platform, some of the things we discussed today, where's the best starting point? Where would you point people to?
Pluralplatform.com is the website and the same name on Twitter. So you will find a bunch of, we only half jokingly call our partners unemployables because they, for some reason, they don't work for any single startup. For some reason, they haven't joined a typical VC firm, but we're gathering under this Plural brand to do stuff together.
Love that. And I know how in demand you are here. You are a bit of a legend in these circles. So just a big thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk.
Thank you so much, Neil.
And there you have it. What an enlightening discussion with Sten there. And his vision for a Europe that is the key player in the global tech scene, and his emphasis on the importance of founders supporting founders, and his learnings from the evolution of Estonian tech scene. Truly inspirational stuff. And through his work with the Plural Platform, Sten is challenging the hierarchical structures typically found in venture capital. And instead, he's building a scalable network of peers dedicated to giving back to the next generation of builders. And I think it's his ambition to foster a product building mindset and aim for a GDP level impact on Europe. So thanks again, Sten, for coming on here, sharing his remarkable journey and vision with us today. And thank you everyone listening for tuning into another episode of Tech Talks Daily. So please, I invite you to join me again tomorrow, where we'll have another insightful discussion about the tech industry's movers and shakers. If you would like to message me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC.Hughes. But it's time for me to go now. I've got another guest to try and find out there. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.